On the discussion about that, we invited Joseph Gregory Mahoney, professor of politics with East China Normal University, and also Huang Jing, director of the Institute of the U.S. and Pacific Studies at Shanghai International Studies University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Professor Mahoney, it is quite a harsh statement against China by the G7. Now, is it going to be helpful in smoothing up the relations among big powers?
You know, we're seeing actually some mixed messaging coming out of the G7. On the one hand, clearly a lot of the messaging does have an anti-China ring to it. But at the same time, there's some reporting that Biden has predicted that soon relations between U.S. and China are going to improve. But, you know, I think that, you know, we've seen a lot of this double messaging from the U.S., not just in this current iteration of China containment efforts, but going back even to the Jiang Zemin years when he famously described the United States taking a two-handed approach, one hand extended in greeting, the other hand pulled back in a fist. I think that we have to wait and see. But clearly, in the broader context, there's still a lot of reason for concern, and certainly a lot of negative messaging, despite some of the positive spin that we're seeing in some of the Western mainstream media.
Professor Huang, is this G7 summit mainly made of rhetorics? Should people take these rhetorics seriously, or are they just going to be part of the political drama that we have seen over the years?
I think it's both. And, you know, the first thing that strikes you about this statement is so long, it's incredibly long, which means that there's not so much convergence among the G7s, a lot of divergence. That's why it takes such a long statement to cover it all. If you look at it, almost cover everything. But on the sense of China, I just mentioned, and it did have some very positive messages, which is quite different from the kind of harsh stand of the White House or Washington, D.C. For example, it emphasized that China has to cooperate with China, want to maintain a stable and constructive relationship with China to handle a lot of challenges human beings face altogether. But on the other hand, of course, we see some rhetorics of anti-China rhetorics, especially on the issue of Taiwan, South China Sea, and so forth.
We have seen some state leaders earlier did not use the word challenge or threat, but rather this time during the G7 summit have been using that specific word. Even though in their own domestic politics, they have been very careful not to use that word to describe China. So are we seeing that the U.S. allies, quote unquote, among the G7 are getting closer to Washington's stance?
Clearly, I agree with my colleague that there are some major divergences. Certainly, you know, we have some mixed messaging coming out of Germany. We know that Macron came to China and then was really sort of breaking ranks with some of his European contemporaries, and even warned that European countries were tipping into vassalage if they continued to follow the United States down this path. We know that economies like that of France and Germany depend on having good access to the Chinese market. So, but we also know that there's a lot of debate within those countries. There are hawks. So yeah, I don't think we yet see a real convergence of shared interests, but clearly Europe and the G7 is a key battleground where the United States is trying to press these countries into more of an alliance with U.S. position vis-a-vis China, and certainly trying to have greater control over those markets, especially in areas related to technology.
Professor Huang, G7 is being described as a club of developed economies or the richest countries. But we have noticed that during the latest summit, it has failed so far to deliver any specific consensus on how to revive the global economy. Besides the Russia-Ukraine conflict, it is trying to address. So has G7 transformed into something else, very different from its earlier from its earlier identity?
I think G7 has never really had a clear identity either on the economic issue or political issue. It's just a club in which that we are the richest people, we are the most powerful one, so we should manage this world. And that's from the very beginning. But later on, because of the end of the Cold War, and also because China's rise, they try to invite, for example, Russia's been invited to G7 to become G8, and now China. So if you look economically, what is very intriguing and indeed ironic that the G7 never work out any economic agreement or economic framework for all of us to work. We know that among the G7 countries, there are two very important agreements reached just a few years ago. One is CPTPP, led by the Japan. Other is the Japan and Europe's agreement on economic cooperation. But strangely, in this G7 statement, they don't mention this two at all. The only reason that one can figure out is that because the United States is not in neither of them. The United States has said very clearly that turned down Japan's invitation for the United States during the CPTPP. United States, the Biden administration in the past few years, and made no effort at all to reach any agreement between the United States and Europe. So on this part, it's extremely interesting, it's empty, it's hollow. That is, among the G7, we do not see any economic agreement given the situation we're facing right now. That is what strikes people as really strange, at least.
There are some statements coming out of the G7 summit about Taiwan as well. Professor Huang, how do you see that? Should Taiwan be discussed at all at the G7 summit?
You notice that the Taiwan is very simple. They always say that they want a stable and situation, stability, and want the issue be solved peacefully, and they against any unilateral change of status quo. That's all Americans' kind of words in the simplest way. If you look at each member countries individually about this, I think the majority of them does not want to get involved in Taiwan affairs at all, except maybe United States and Japan. So this is a kind of obvious, a kind of cover up. In our Chinese, we gave American a face. In other words, do not let them to be too embarrassed.
Professor Mahoney?
Yeah, I think the European countries largely have made it clear that they don't want to be involved in that conflict or potential conflict, and it really is Japan at this point and the United States that keep hammering this issue.
The role of Japan is a very interesting question this time, particularly as a strong ally of the U.S. Japan has been very instrumental in trying to push forward the agenda about the U.S. Political approach toward China. But how do you see the role of Japan this time? And also, what does it reflect about the political ambition or geopolitical ambition of Japan as a result? Professor Mahoney.
Well, it's clear that Japan feels the need for whatever reason, and we can find different competing narratives why Japan wants to remilitarize, why they want to develop their military into an attack-capable or offense-capable military at this point in time. But my sense is, Japan is very concerned not simply about challenges that may or may not be rising vis-a-vis China, and certainly not even that concerned, I think, although it's often used as an excuse related to North Korea. But also, I think Japan has this understanding that it has a number of vulnerabilities. It has been stuck for a long time in the middle income trap. It is absolutely stuck in a security trap with the United States. And it understands, I think, that the United States is not a reliable ally. It has to bank on the U.S. at this time, economically and militarily. I don't think they have a geopolitical ambitions. I think they're really looking at short and long-term survival concerns.
I think Japan, as a host country of the G7, of course, it has played a very important role in the agenda setting for the entire summit. And I agree with Professor Mahoney's point is that Japan is cornered in two senses. Number one, let's keep in mind, Japan is not a normal country. It is nation that is under the control of the United States diplomatically and in terms of security. But moreover, in the larger picture, Japan is in a very unfavorable situation right now, because if I were Japanese leaders, I would not put myself in a situation against both major powers in the region. It's a nightmare for Japan to be a kind of against both China and Russia. That is a very bad situation.
Last question. We see a lot of words being invented in recent years as geopolitics evolve. But sometimes people use the same word with very different meanings. And sometimes they use words that they don't even know what the meanings are. So I really wonder, what is de-risking?
You know, I think that the word de-risking certainly has a much better sound to it than decoupling, and certainly it plays well among a large number of pundits and financial advisors who always like to talk about risks and mitigating risk. And so it has a very normative ring to it. My concern is that on the one hand, it represents the fact that they were unable to create this shared understanding on decoupling, because frankly, the risk of decoupling is greater than the risk of not decoupling at this point. So it's, you know, they have to try to, I think this is really something that we're seeing coming out of the United States as trying to seek a middle ground. So we can't really talk yet about decoupling because that's too dangerous, and we have all these countries that aren't really ready for it, and they're already too perhaps overexposed. And but my concern is that it is intelligent for people to manage their risk as long as that management isn't a double standard. In other words, part of the reason why countries face a risk with China is because of what the United States is doing to increase those risks. You know, companies in South Korea and other places, they have to look at de-risking, trying to manage their risk or their exposure to China because of what the United States is doing. So that's one problem. The other problem is, you know, it's much easier to sell de-risking to a broad population in France or Germany, but in pursuing the goals of de-risking, as long as you're operating under this double standard, then what you're actually doing is taking these half steps towards decoupling. And I think that would be the concern that I would have as a strategic objective of the United States is, okay, we can't go directly to decoupling right now, but let's take these half steps to de-risking as long as we have these double standards in place.
Professor Huang, is it a word game?
No, I think that if we look at de-risk, the copyright is from Germany. Germany, you know, created this term called de-risk. From Germany's point of view, of course, de-risk means Germany's economy. Germany's economy has been too much dependent on Russia's energy. So the extension of that is that they should not become too dependent on China, Chinese economy, Chinese market. But that's ridiculous, because economic interdependence is not a result of any government's policy or strategy. It's a result of market forces. In other words, if you look at Japan or Germany, all of them are really dependent on the outside world, already depend on the global economy. This is a fact. They cannot change. So in that way, de-risk does not make any sense at all, because this economic interdependence created by market economy is irrevocable. And if you took up de-risk as a security de-risk, then it is United States that has military bases in Japan and in Germany. It's America's armed forces all over the world presented. It is United States that's initiated and involved every single war since World War II or since Cold War is over. So if you want to talk about security, it is a country that has a military power all over that has created all those security risks for all of us. It is not China, which has been peaceful ever since.
I'm sure the rhetorics wars are going to continue. For now, I want to thank both of you for joining us. Huang Jing, Joseph Gregory Mahoney, thank you so much, gentlemen.